anyone in the audience had seen the film previously? A couple of you. Okay. So I think we're going to start by asking Nico to make some remarks about the film, about its reception, a little bit about how it was unusual in the context of the early 50s. So do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Shani, and great to see people come out for this film. Yeah, I just have some remarks, give a little more context about the release of the film, and then I thought also maybe we could go back to Doyen and hear more about the making of the film, because it is a really extraordinary story. So as Shani mentioned, this is often said to be the only film that was blacklisted. That's somewhat of a, you know, wasn't a sort of literal blacklisting, but it was, there was a concerted campaign to thwart the production, as we heard at the earlier, and also then bury its release. So it's the only film made by this independent production corporation, and I have a number of quotations here that I think are very evocative to suggest some of the both the what was going on while it was made and the reception of it. Howard Hughes, who was then head of RKO Pictures, said, "We can stop them in the labs, we can stop them in the sound studios, we can stop them in the cutting rooms." The Congressman Donald Jackson of California denounced it on the floor of Congress. He said it was a new weapon for Russia, deliberately designed to inflame racial hatreds and to depict the United States of America as the enemy of all colored people. The Hollywood Reporter announced the production of the film by calling it a commie film shot in New Mexico under direct orders from the Kremlin. Needless to say, this is not actually the case. And in fact, this was largely anticipated by the filmmakers, right? So as was mentioned earlier, 4 of the participants were already victims of the blacklist. The director, Herbert Biberman, who was one of the Hollywood 10, and as Shani mentioned, spent 6 months in jail for contempt of Congress. The other 3 were Michael Wilson, the screenwriter, who had recently won an Academy Award for A Place in the Sun, the actor Will Greer, and Paul Jarrico, the producer. And meanwhile, as was mentioned beforehand, right, the star, Rosario Roosevelt, who was one of 5 professional actors with Will Greer, was deported before the film was completed. So it's sort of an extraordinary circumstances. And then she was later blacklisted in Mexico also for her participation in this film. So having been victims of the blacklist, they sort of knew they couldn't make an ordinary film. So they were making it outside the system, and they decided in advance not to try to soften it. Jarrico said they wanted to make a crime to fit the punishment, right? Because they had already been punished. So we can talk about how difficult the film was to make, how it was buried and nearly crushed in its release. But as Doyen mentioned earlier, I mean, it's also sort of a miracle this film was made and released at all. There are really no comparable American films of the era, and it would take another decade, really. This is 1954. It was released for sort of more radical American political independent cinema to emerge, and the blacklist certainly had a lot to do with that. As in the words of Emile de Antonio's, a political documentary filmmaker, the shabby, seamy complicity between the moguls, the unions, the government and its federal police, Howard Hughes, the film laboratories, and even the labs amounted to a genuine conspiracy against Salt of the Earth. And it's notable too, the editor who was hired for the film turned out to be an FBI informant. So on and on we have these crazy things. So the implication of the McCarthy witch hunt that resulted in this blacklisting was that, there were already communist messages in Hollywood films, right? Sort of hidden in them or smuggled into them almost a little like subliminal advertising, and they never really presented much evidence for that. But Salt of the Earth, as a truly independent production by blacklisted filmmakers, had no need to be subtly subversive, right? It was the opportunity to make a kind of uncompromised pro-labor feminist film from the point of view of Mexican Americans, in which the Anglo figures are the villains. Paul Jarrico put it as it was a film of labor, by labor, for labor. And so it is really pretty unprecedented as for an American feature, not only of that era, but really well beyond it, I think. You have precedents of the sort of films of the Workers' Film and Photo League in the 30s, and then in the 60s we start to get newsreel, but this is all documentary material, and to have a feature film of this nature is pretty extraordinary. I mean, there isn't really another film like Salt of the Earth. So what kind of release did it have? In '54, it was the union projectionists refused to show it, which is sort of an irony, obviously. But there was an enormous amount of pressure at the time. But the film did open, right? It showed in New York City at the 86th Street Grand Theater, which was on 86th Street and Lexington Avenue. And it played for 9 weeks. It did extremely well. It's a single screen theater. And it made about 50 grand. It also played in the Bronx and did considerably less well. But this was a theater that took a risk, right? It was a theater that at the time basically only showed German imports, right? It wasn't a regular commercial theater. And it then presented the film as a left-wing controversial film, that was the sort of label put on the film. In San Francisco, for example, it showed in Chinatown in a theater that had otherwise only screened Chinese language cinema. So again, it was these theaters that were sort of on the margins that took a risk and showed this film. So in total, it showed in 11 theaters in the US. In New York, California, it showed in Silver City, New Mexico, where it was shot. And then it was also revived in 1965. It again showed in New York City at a theater on 28th Street and Broadway. But so it did have a release, but it was a very minimal release. Today, I think it's preserved by the Library of Congress, but it's still relatively unavailable. It's actually not hard to find. If you search for it online, you can find it on YouTube and so on. But it's not on any of the major streaming platforms, for example. Hasn't gotten the Criterion treatment or anything. What's that? It is on Amazon Prime. Okay. Except for Amazon. I was interested for this event as information I didn't know before, but I was sort of also looking at what the reviews were like at the time. And many of them weren't bad. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times sort of cut it down to size a little. He called it a calculated social document and a special interest film. But otherwise, he was quite positive. He also called it a starkly poignant story that develops considerable personal drama and raw emotion and power. And he also detailed the film's controversies and said, in light of this agitated history, it's somewhat surprising to find that Salt of the Earth is in substance simply a strong pro-labor film with a particularly sympathetic interest in Mexican Americans, in the Mexican Americans with whom it deals. And in the Los Angeles Daily News, interestingly, there was a sort of similar defense of the film's politics around the notion that in some ways it was less radical than its enemies were presenting it as. This is a quote from that review. If there is propaganda in this picture, it is not an alien one, but an assertion of principles no thoughtful American can reject. That was a very positive review. Meanwhile, Pauline Kael, a relatively young critic at the time, later become the famous New Yorker critic, was then writing for the British magazine Sight and Sound, and she was not so kind. Her review may have been the most extensive treatment of Salt of the Earth that it received in English at the time of its release. And I think it's worth dwelling on in some ways for a certain kind of liberal anti-communism that is also couched in a certain kind of cultural milieu that Cale would later bring to the New Yorker. So she paired it with a kind of crude anti-communist B film made by Hollywood, and basically said they have the same problems, right? The anti-communist film and the communist film are both fail as art because they're serving politics, essentially. And so she went on to call Salt of the Earth extremely shrewd propaganda for the urgent business of the USSR, making colonial peoples believe they can expect no good from the United States, convincing Europe and Asia and the rest of the world that there are no civil liberties in the USA and that our capitalism is really fascism. This is all Pauline Kael.
So untrue.
Yeah. So, but it was part of the same anxieties that and the film did play well in Europe. It showed in China. It did had openings around the world. So there's this anxiety, obviously, this Cold War anxiety about it reflecting poorly on the United States. A couple more quotes from Kael. She remarked on the way, as Doyne mentioned, that the filmmakers spoke to the people of the town who had participated in the strike and got their suggestions on the script and incorporated those. And she said, a film as dreary and programmatic as the films this method led to a film as dreary and programmatic as the films made by those who have collective criticism forced upon them. Even more scathingly, she wrote, a film like Salt of the Earth seems so ridiculously and patently false that it requires something like determination to consider that those who made it believe in it. So she also saw the film as a kind of moral blackmail. She said liberals and progressives might be fooled by it because it presents suffering instead of American prosperity, which is a sort of emotional ploy, according to her. She said she had the anxiety that you would be considered a strike breaker if you didn't like it. So I linger on Kael's review because I think it's symptomatic of a more subtle rejection of the film's importance from liberal cultural institutions in a way that I think is still maybe familiar today. So Kael is both anti-communist but also anti-McCarthyist, but she wants Salt of the Earth's political intervention she sees as suspicious for it undermining certain received wisdom she has about American capitalism and post-war prosperity. She makes no acknowledgement of the film's uniqueness or why so many felt it was necessary to squash it, nor does she give any real consideration to the question of historical accuracy. So Salt of the Earth, I think, can be seen as a rare example of a kind of American neorealism. I think stylistically it's not that close to Italian neorealism, but the use of location shooting and non-actors is again quite unique and brings it in proximity to Italian neorealism. But in many ways, it is a kind of classical narrative about overcoming adversity, which I think also undermines the sort of way in which Kael presents it as this kind of bleak picture. It's actually a very inspiring picture. No Hollywood film had ever shown a strike positively from the workers' point of view, let alone focused on women and minorities the way this film had. And I think for Kael's sensibility, this reads as falseness, because to accept this film would be to confront the possibility that America's post-war prosperity was not evenly distributed, right, or not the whole story. There was another film from 1954 that Pauline Kael called Great, and said it gave us a glimpse of real America. So in the year Salt of the Earth got this tiny release, 1954, one of the most critically successful films was On the Waterfront. And it was an enormous commercial success as well as the one of the top 10 box office films of the year, and it went on to win 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Elia Kazan, who named names at the House Un-American Activities Committee, also Best Screenplay for Bud Schulberg, who was also named names, was also a friendly witness, and notably named Herbert Biberman, the director of Salt of the Earth. So On the Waterfront, which I think for certainly some legitimate reasons is considered a classic today, is also, if you've seen it, an explicitly anti-union film that celebrates as a hero the informant, right? And it does all that in the context of presenting itself as a film from the point of view of the working class. So I think Salt of the Earth, we could say, provides a kind of rare antidote to the politics of On the Waterfront. And therefore, it was a threat not only to the anti-communist hysteria of the right, but also to a kind of upper middle class liberal cultural consensus made uneasy by real challenges to the American institutions that assured their comfort and their cultural sensibilities. So I'll stop there, but I think it would be great to hear more about the making of the film, or that maybe we got a little cut off.
I think you covered most of the essential points. As I said, it was totally remarkable they managed to do it, because actually Howard Hughes's letter to Congressman Waxman had 7 points. He said, Biberman, Jarrico, and their associates cannot succeed in their scheme alone. Before they can complete the picture, they must have the help of the following. And I have to also say, Howard Hughes, some of you younger people may not know, he was the Elon Musk of his day. Very famous man, brilliant engineer, built the largest plane ever, made a lot of fairly bad movies, but was a lover of Katharine Hepburn, and owned a lot of casinos eventually in Hollywood. But they said, cannot make it without the following: film laboratories, suppliers of film, musicians and recording technicians necessary to record music, technicians who make dissolves, fades, etc., owners and operators of sound recording equipment and dubbing rooms, positive and negative editors and cutters, laboratories that make release prints. They fought like hell to get every single one of these things done. And the film to be edited, they edited in 5 different locations because they had to keep moving, because when they were found out, they would be chased away. One of the major ones was a women's bathroom in an abandoned theater in West Hollywood. So they had to develop the film in little snippets. To record the score, normally in those days you would record the score by playing the film, having an orchestra in the studio, and then directing the orchestra in time with the film. Well, they couldn't do that, because as soon as they saw the film, all the orchestra people would know they were in big trouble if they went along. So they actually did a blank wall, and the director had a timer that basically told them when the scene changes happened. I already mentioned they didn't have rushes. They overcame huge odds, but the thing that wasn't on Howard Hughes's list was you have to have a theater to show the film in. They had a few, but not nearly what they should have had. And you have to have publicity, and no newspaper would publicize this film. A sort of word of mouth, and some of the reviews did, but they were not allowed to, they were not able to put ads in anywhere. So I guess, what this hits me is we're all pretty concerned about censorship these days, for good reason. But this isn't entirely new. And what you see is when you threaten people's livelihoods, if you can say, you will not be able to make a living unless you cooperate with us, that's a very powerful instrument to get people to conform. And so it was remarkable. They managed to work around all that to get the film done. Maybe one other thing to stress is that this wasn't just the film industry. We tend to think of the blacklist as a film industry. There were blacklists in many different companies. I was mentored by a brilliant physicist who was not able to get a job in any electronics company in the US because on his thesis committee had been Frank Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer's brother, who was actually a member of the Communist Party. As a result, he went to Western New Mexico University in Silver City and, hung out with, started an Explorer post. So had a huge positive impact on my life, actually. But because he wasn't able to make his living doing the thing he felt was what he should have been doing. And I think we're seeing that already happening now. And we shouldn't underestimate the power of that club.
I just wanted to add because
Oh, thank you.
because you mentioned, affecting people's livelihoods. One of the things you'll learn if you see this exhibit at New York Historical Society was the very deep and profound effect that blacklisting had on people who were blacklisted. Many of them never worked again. The blacklisting lasted for years or even decades for some of them. There were a number of people who were blacklisted who killed themselves. They couldn't make money. Not only could they not work in the film industry, but they had a hard time just providing for themselves. So I just wanted to add that. We'll turn to questions from the audience in a few minutes, but I have a question for both of you, if that's all right. I would love to hear more about the formal elements in this film, and the decisions that were made about how the film was shot, and the scenes and character development and so forth. What is it that makes this a unique film formally, and how do you think those formal elements underline the message of the film? The movie that we showed last week called Rendezvous of the Docks, which was released in 1955, but the police came and grabbed the negatives when they showed it in the first theater, and then the director thought it was lost for 30 years till it turned up in an archive. Anyway, so it has a lot of similarities with this film, and when film critics finally saw it, they said this is the missing link between Renoir's film Tony in 1936 and the French New Wave. So they were really seeing it in some ways as a precursor of the French New Wave. So
yeah, I mean it's a good question. I mean there is Biberman was trained in the Hollywood tradition, and so was the screenwriter. And there are many respects in which this is, as I was saying, formally and not a especially radical film. I mean, it really moves narratively, and it doesn't have the kind of, sort of playing out of time that you get in, say, Italian neorealism, nor does it have, the sort of montage, say, of, an Eisenstein strike or something like that. But there, I do think one of the things that makes it striking is the combination of a certain kind of well-made Hollywood film in many respects, though with all kinds of limitations that were, attached to its independent production and all this crazy stuff going on, and the use of, locations and location shooting and non-actors. And I do think one of the things that makes it formally very interesting is the use of non-actors, because you could say that was a sort of limitation, that they couldn't get professional actors in some cases and so on and so forth, so they use the head of the union. But I think there's something almost, there sometimes can be a kind of awkwardness in the delivery from some of the non-actors, but in a way that is quite moving, because these are people who have lived this in varying degrees. And there's something almost kind of, a little bit Brechtian or something about these people speaking lines in a a sort of less, let's say, polished, actorly way in a number of moments in the film that I think give it a kind of authenticity that'll look forward to independent film in the 60s. But that's, it's just some thoughts. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, I just think it's a good story. You've got a good story, a really well-written screenplay, and a lot of human elements to it. You really viscerally feel like you're there, and you know, these were real struggles. Pauline Kael is so far out to lunch. It's just ridiculous. Because when you read accounts of the real thing, it was even rougher. They didn't just get hit by the car. A woman got drugged 300 feet by the car. People got beaten up severely. So they were threatened. There was an evening where they really thought everybody was going to come and attack them, and everybody was waiting with their guns, that the vigilantes were about to get them. And that's when the state police showed up. And the remarkable thing is 35 cars full of state police. This tiny little place. They were everywhere. They basically, you see there were elements of the system that were working. And they were able to take advantage of those. And the ridiculous thing is that, you know, when it was shown abroad, people said, well, I actually think it had the opposite effect of what the people that didn't want to see it get out, because finally Americans were thinking about labor. And if they hadn't banned it, it would have probably had a very positive effect on the perception of America. So, yeah. Pardon?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you.
Well, I think it was broadly what happened. They just wore the opposition down. I mean, the jail scene's the really famous one. And, but yeah, I think we pretty much saw an accurate rendition of how the strike was resolved. They ran out of tools.
I think one thing that's interesting is to think about the parallels between the strike and the making of the film, because they're both going up against the powerful, those who have power and money. They succeed largely because they're working in a collaborative way, in a mutually supportive way. The writing of Doyne mentioned that the writing was done with a lot of input from the people who lived there and lived through the strike. There were dozens of readings. There were public meetings where they would review the script together. So I think it's really interesting to think about those parallels. I was going to ask you, Doyne, about to what extent what happens in the movie reflects what happened in the strike, like what the role of women. You said that the prison scene actually happened. And who's the white guy?
The white guy's interesting. Clinton Jinks. I heard about him as a kid because he was a communist, and he was there organizing as a communist. Because the Communist Party at the time believed in gender equality and racial equality, and they really put, their money, they put their action where their mouth was. And so he was a controversial figure. People did view this as something that was organized by communists, and so if you were on the management side, you had a negative view, and if you were on the workers' side, you had a positive view. My father thought it was a pretty remarkable thing. And as I said, he knew Juan Chacon fairly well and had a lot of respect for him. But, I think we forget what an extreme bad word communist was in that day. If you got labeled a communist, you had a black cloud over your head, and people would, it was a pretty bad label to be attached to somebody. Yeah.
So maybe we'll take some time for a couple of questions, and then we'll save some time to show the Hollywood 10 after questions. And please speak into the microphone, really hold it up close so that everyone can hear you.
Yes, I was curious how the strong feminist message in the film came into being for the time that it was written. It seems to me a woman would have to have been involved.
Well, I think the women who you saw in the movie were involved. They had a hand in the way the script was done. But I think it also reflects really well on Michael Wilson, who he came and watched. And I have a quote somewhere, but they said he was like a sponge. He was just absorbing what he was seeing and echoing back, trying to put in the dramatic personal narrative that you saw between Juan Chacon and Rosada Revueltas and so on. But I think it was just, it was part of the story. And and he had the perceptiveness to put it in there, and it was tempered and smoothed out by the women involved that he took cues from. I would love to see the original script and compare it to the final script.
I just want to add, I read a little bit about the role of women and how much that impacted them subsequently. And it seems as though they came into their role during the strike and, you know, asserted a stronger role over the course of the strike, as is portrayed in the film. And then apparently that continued to impact gender roles for some time after the strike was over, and then things reverted a little bit too much to gender roles. But I think that's an accurate portrayal of their role and really of a shift in relationships. Okay, what a question back here and then over here. Oh, okay. The microphone is closer to you, so you can go next.
Hi there. That exhibit at the New York Historical is really worth seeing. I saw it earlier. I saw the New York Historical exhibit's really worth seeing. I saw it earlier in the week. I guess Biberman and Jarrico and Wilson had been filmmakers before because it's very professional. Wondered how they got the money to create this, and then what did they do, were they able to do afterwards? Because as you said, a lot of these people were blacklisted. They had to leave the country, as they show in the exhibit. They stopped working, or they worked under pseudonyms. I just wondered what happened to these people.
I mean, first it was remarkable that the film was funded, but it was partly because there were people who really didn't like the blacklist and supported quietly what they were doing. So they didn't have serious problems. I mean, they at times had to go out and raise some money, but they always got the money. And Jarrico estimated that it cost them 5 months of extra time in the production, and he said the equivalent of $100,000 of extra expense, which, if you translate that in today's currency, is $1.2 million. So they had to raise extra money to make that happen. They got support from many quarters. You know, there was a year-long trial. A trial actually that went for many years, where they sued the film union and tried to get compensated for the conspiracy that was held against them. In the end, the jury didn't go along with the conspiracy argument, which is because some of the jurors even admitted they didn't want to grant that to some communists. But there, in that case, for example, they found a lawyer that devoted 6 years of his life to bringing the trial at no cost. And so the people contributed out of the woodwork as they could. So they got some ground roots support.
I think the union also contributed. They're acknowledged financially.
Oh,
they're
yeah.
acknowledged
The
at the beginning of
yeah.
the film. Yeah, the miners' union,
Yeah.
which is also really unusual.
Yeah.
And Biberman, his passport was taken away. He wasn't allowed to leave. As I mentioned at the beginning, those who were outside of the country lost their passports and couldn't come back, and vice versa. And I don't think he made too many more films. Michael Wilson had the most success. So you could talk a little bit
Well,
about
Michael Wilson had success because as a screenwriter, you can write under a pseudonym. There were several movies that nobody took the awards when they were given. And those awards eventually, you know, in many cases decades later, were finally given. Biberman worked in the construction industry for quite a few years. I guess he did eventually manage to come back and make another film.
He made a film in the late 60s that I haven't seen, but I know there's people who admire it, yeah.
And you know, by the way, the people on the set, the mine workers, began calling him L. Biberman. So that was his nickname, and they got along very well.
Okay, a question back there.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, just hold it
I
really
had the
close. Yeah.
question, same question that the other person just asked about where they found the money. That was one question. The other question was why was Howard Hughes so torqued about it?
How was
Howard Hughes was upset about this film, or he right?
Well, Howard Hughes, they went to because the congressman wanted to get advice about how to stop it. And they said, Hughes knows the film business. He's a right-wing guy. We'll ask him. And so he gave them the formula, and they followed that. Huge amounts of effort by the film, the FBI. There was a huge amount of effort to squelch the film at Howard Hughes's direction, or following the script that he wrote for them. He didn't direct the day-to-day part. I don't know if
I can't help but think of Harlan County, USA in this film. And I wondered, I actually was in West Virginia among coal miners in that period. I saw it somewhere in West Virginia. We got a copy of it. And I wondered if they actually saw it at Harlan County. Do you have any idea if Barbara Koppel actually showed the film? Do you know anything about the making of the Harlan County? Because there are a lot of similarities, even though this is a documentary.
Yeah.
There's the sort of effervescence of the people in the movie. It's pretty interesting.
I wouldn't be surprised if she saw it, but I don't have any knowledge of that. But yes, but that film it's another great American strike film, but it's also a film where the women play a fundamental role on the picket line. So it's has some interesting parallels. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question and then we'll play the Hollywood 10. I think if any of you want to hang around for a little bit afterwards and ask some additional questions, that's probably okay. No, it's okay for Dylan. I'm not sure about Nico. Anyway, so your question, yeah. Oops,
That's it says the film was made in 1954. Was the strike? When was the strike?
The strike was 1952.
Okay.
The film was filmed in 53, or early 54 maybe. I don't remember the chronology exactly.
I think 53. Yeah.
Yeah, but so then it took them quite a while to finish the film because of all the hurdles I mentioned. So
one other quick thing. Historically, the scholars and academicians have always been behind workers and their movements. Was there a lot of speaking out among Columbia people, or other scholars to support this? And in other words, now we have this situation where historically the scholars always supported the workers. Now the workers are saying, you're talking down to us and we're against you. But at that time, I mean, even before Karl Marx, the scholars were behind the workers, I think. Was there anyone speak out, or were they afraid to do that as well, the way they are now?
Well, I mean, there were certainly some reviewers and so on, as you mentioned, who said very positive things about the film. Yeah, professors, I don't know. Do you know?
I mean, my sense is, I mean, in terms looking at scholarly literature on the film, it comes later. I mean, there isn't really anything I could see in the 50s. But I think that it was the re-release in '65 that kind of made people more aware of it, or a new generation that was maybe a little bit more political and not under the sort of, the heat of the, Cold War in quite the same way as during the blacklist McCarthy period. But
and academics were being fired for their views about communism too. So I expect people were a bit nervous about speaking out. And plus, most people didn't see it.
Yeah.
It
I
wasn't
was going to say
possible
there's
see it.
also the problem of distribution. People couldn't see the film. That was a very deliberate effort. So, okay, so we're going to play the Hollywood 10. It's 15 minutes. It's worth waiting for if you'd like to. Thank you very much for your appreciation and for staying for this discussion, which I think was really rich. So maybe let's have a round of applause for Nico and Doyne.
Thank you.